The Part 7 notes is going to be on biodiversity and human impact. Biodiversity is going to be all the differences amongst life in all of its forms in all locations across the globe. So we're going to be talking about different levels of biodiversity. There can be ecosystem diversity, which is going to include all the differences amongst organisms that live together within a community. These would include all those interspecific relationships we've been talking about. Each species depends on each other because of their differences in some way, shape, or form. It would include competition between species, things like that. Species diversity is going to be the variety or differences amongst species across the planet. So this is when we would look at those phylogenetic trees, species that were alive in the past, species alive today, and look at all these differences that ultimately lead to them being different species. Genetic diversity is going to be differences within a gene pool of a population of species. And this is going to be important in regards to evolution because these differences in genetics lead to adaptations, right? If they provide an advantage. And ultimately, this can lead to evolution within the gene pool over time. So far, less than 2 million species have been discovered, named, and described across the planet. But scientists estimate that there are many more that still do need to be discovered. In fact, we really have no idea how many species are truly out there on this planet. They estimate that the range is somewhere between 2 and 10 million species of eukaryotes that are alive on Earth today. So this doesn't even include the bacteria. Prokaryotes are always incredibly small, microscopic. They can live in incredibly harsh conditions, and it would be impossible for us to estimate how many of them are still undiscovered, but a lot, surely a lot. These numbers are numbers that you do need to know. So these are numbers from the IB textbook, so do make sure that you know them. A lot of species that are undiscovered probably live in either extreme conditions that we have a hard time getting to, perhaps intense elevations, caves, things like that. Also in the oceans. The oceans are vast, they're dark, they're expensive, they're deep. It's very hard to explore the oceans thoroughly, and much of these undiscovered organisms do probably live there. In addition to that, there are many microbes that are eukaryotes as well. Many protists, some species of fungi, for example, and so they also would be difficult to discover. The fossil evidence suggests that there are more species alive today on the planet than there ever were in the past. In the past, we have had 5 mass extinctions, with the most recent being about 66 million years ago. This would be the one that resulted in the loss of the dinosaurs. These particular extinctions were all due to phenomena that were out of our control. So volcanic activity, major volcanic activity, either deep within the ocean or on land, could be asteroid collisions. There were major ice ages, but all of these extinctions were due to massive climate change that ultimately caused much of the species to go extinct in a short period of time. Typically, a mass extinction means that about 75% at least of the species alive have been lost to extinction within like maybe a few million years. Between these mass extinction events, though, you will get new open niches that will allow for new life forms to arise. So we do typically get these big booms of biodiversity that gradually starts after the mass extinction and then increases after that. Biodiversity is always a good thing for an ecosystem. It's going to increase the sustainability. Biodiversity is composed of both species richness and species evenness. Species richness refers to the number of different species that are present within that particular ecosystem or community, whereas species evenness refers to how many organisms there are of each species and how close those numbers are to each other. So how evenly distributed are these different species within those particular ecosystems. we want high levels of both. So evenly distributed and a lot of richness. The more species, the better. So here shows two different communities. They have the same level of richness. They both have 4 species present, but their evenness differs. So community 1 is more evenly distributed compared to community 2. Therefore, from a biodiversity standpoint, community 1 would be more sustainable, more biodiverse. There are math calculations that allow for us to assess biodiversity. And the one that we'll use in this class is called Simpson's Reciprocal Index of Diversity. These will take into account both richness and evenness within the calculation. High values of D means a higher level of biodiversity, and low values of D would mean the opposite. The lowest value of D would be 1, which could only be achieved if the community only contained 1 species. The formula for Simpson's Reciprocal Index of Diversity is shown on this slide, and we will practice it within this set of notes, but also in an upcoming activity. It is important that you memorize the formula because the formula will not be given to you on the test. This formula, in this formula, big N represents the total number of organisms of all species found. So you would have to add them all up. And then little n represents the total number in each particular species. So let's go ahead and practice with the formula. In this particular example, there are 5 total species and there are 3 samples. So I've done sample 1 already. Remember, big N represents all the species present. So in sample 1, there are 50 species present. And then little n represents the total amount in each species. And you need to add the bottom together because it is the sum of many different calculations. So there will be one calculation for each species present within the sample. In sample 1, there was 10 individuals of each species, so the numbers are all the same. But in sample 2 and 3, that is not true. So go ahead and do the calculations for sample 2 and 3, pause the recording, and then when you're done, you can unpause it and see the answers. So hopefully you came up with sample 2 has a Simpson's diversity index value of 4.01, and then sample 3 is 1.1. And so from this you could form conclusions. You could form that sample 1 is the most biodiverse, and you could also say that both sample 1 and 2 are diverse. Sample 3 is the least diverse. It's also hardly diverse at all. It's a very low index number. Be careful, don't Google the formula because there are actually several different types of Simpson's calculations out there. They are related, but they are different. And we are specifically using Simpson's reciprocal index. Technically, this formula would be 1 over D, but the equation has already taken this into account. So just don't Google it. Instead, please just use the formula from your notes. Endemic species are species that are native to a particular area versus alien species are not. They were typically introduced there by humans. This can be accidental. For example, some species of snakes, people have gotten them as pets and then realized they grew too big or they were too hard to take care of or they simply didn't want those any longer, so they released their snakes. And then those snakes in the wild did well, and it was an alien species that quickly turned invasive. Or another thing that could happen is they get accidentally introduced. For example, lots of species will come over on cargo ships. So insects, rats, for example, they may come over on these cargo ships, seeds of plants. And when they do, they can eventually make their way into this new ecosystem where they may take over. Pardon my puppies barking in the background. Alien species may quickly become invasive if they are able to increase in number rapidly and spread rapidly throughout an ecosystem. This is typically due to the fact that they don't have their natural limiting factors in this new ecosystem. And this allows them to grow quickly out of control. So for example, the predators that would normally keep them in check are missing. Diseases that would normally spread through that ecosystem that would decrease their numbers are missing. And of course, their natural competitors are also missing. And so this gives them a really high chance to flourish. Invasive species may have negative effects on the ecosystem that it moves to. It may eliminate native organisms through competition. Remember that competitive exclusion principle will not allow for more than one species to thrive within the same ecological niche. And so ultimately, this would reduce the realized niches of some of the native species to make them even smaller than they would have been if they could fundamentally exist without the invasive species. This also would result in a reduction in biodiversity, allowing the ecosystem to not be as sustainable. It can also have economical consequences, and so we are going to look at a specific example on the next slide. I'm going to show you this video. Please go ahead and take notes in your note taker on this specific example. This is a classic example of an invasive species, and it does impact things that occur here in the United States.
Damage to the Great Lakes. Usher Karashi of WTTW Chicago reports.
It's just after dawn in northern Wisconsin. Commercial fisherman Dennis Hickey is getting ready to take his fishing boat out on Lake Michigan. Hickey's family has fished these waters for more than a century. The Great Lakes currently support a $7 billion a year commercial and recreational fishing industry.
Our mainstay of our fishery here in Bailey's Harbor is whitefish, Lake Michigan whitefish.
Today, Hickey's lucky. He won't be battling the elements to bring in a catch. It's unseasonably warm on this late autumn morning. But he does have to deal with a problem that increasingly plagues fishermen throughout the Great Lakes and threatens their livelihoods.
Looks like the hearts have quite a bit of moss and slime in them again.
The slime is a type of alga called Cladophora, and some scientists think its extraordinary increase in the Great Lakes is related to recent and irreparable changes in the marine ecosystem. The culprit, they say, is a tiny invasive mollusk called the quagga mussel.
To me, it's one of the worst, if not the worst.
Tom Nalepa is a research biologist with the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. For the last 20 years, Nalepa and his team have been assessing population trends and the impact of the mussel invasion on the Great Lakes.
They find conditions very suitable and just explode in terms of population numbers. And during the period of exponential growth, they wreak havoc on other organisms. They take away resources, outcompete native species.
Henry Henderson is director of the Natural Resources Defense Council.
They wreck the life that's in there and create a new ecosystem that is dangerous for our health and safety in fundamentally devastating ways. You can see it happen in Lake Erie. It's on the edge of collapse.
Scientists believe the quagga mussel first stowed away in the ballast water on transoceanic ships from the Caspian Sea. The mussels made their way into the lakes when that ballast water was purged. The tiny fingernail-sized mussels, closely related to another invasive, known as the zebra mussel, first appeared in lake waters here in 1988.
These are typical quagga mussels in Lake Michigan. They have the striping as zebra mussels do. They have a little flatter shell.
The quagga mussel is now the most pervasive and destructive invasive species ever to enter the Great Lakes. Over the last 15 years, the quagga population has exploded, eclipsing the zebra mussel and infecting all 5 of the Great Lakes. Nalepa estimates there are now 437 trillion in Lake Michigan alone. And the reason scientists say this dominating mussel is so destructive is that it is wiping out critical food at the bottom of the food chain. Organisms like plankton, the main food source for a shrimp-like organism known as Diaperia.
It's a very important fish food organism, hence this has led to declines in the growth and condition of fish populations that once depended upon diapry as a food source. So it's led to a cascading effect from one species to the other throughout the food web.
In addition to altering the food chain in the Great Lakes, these mussels attach to all types of surfaces, like boats, buoys, and docks. They clog water intake pipes, sometimes cutting off drinking water supplies that require expensive remediation, which is why the financial impact from these tiny invaders is staggering. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates the economic losses over the last decade at about $5 billion within the Great Lakes region alone. At the DuSable Harbor on Chicago's Lake Shore, operations manager Kirk Kleist pulls up a dock anchor chain to show just how pervasive the mussels have become in nearshore areas.
They load up so much, they cause problems.
Kleist, who has been a diver for over 3 decades, says he's seen the dramatic changes in the lake water caused by mussel filtering.
30 years ago, you had 5 foot of visibility at the max. Now I've seen 40 to 60 foot of visibility.
But scientists say clear water in this case is in fact a bad thing.
Water clarity has increased 2 or 3-fold just because of the ability of mussels to, filter all the particles out of the water, which they use as food. So, if you like clear water, certainly when you look out at Lake Michigan, you have it. But clear water also means that there's no food in the water for all the other organisms.
The other side effect of excess clarity caused by the quagga's filtering is that it encourages explosive algal blooms like Cladophora and toxic algae known as microcystis.
They allow for the first time in the life of the Great Lakes sunlight to pierce all the way down to the bottom of the lake from Erie on, and that creates the ability for toxic algae to grow, which is poisonous and a threat to our public health and safety.
These images taken by NOAA and the U.S. Geological Survey last month reveal just how overwhelming the algae have become in the Great Lakes. A report published by the National Wildlife Federation called the toxic algal bloom that infested Lake Erie's western basin this year and caused mass beach closings the most harmful ever recorded.
When the Cladophora wash up on beaches, they often harbor problematic bacteria, including botulism, which can then negatively impact fish and birds that consume somewhere in the food web.
Michael Murray is a staff scientist with the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and co-authored the report. Murray says the Great Lakes are experiencing both feast and famine, because while algae is growing in record amounts in coastal areas, there is also the formation of nutrient deserts in offshore waters.
So the overall effect is we're seeing still a lot of nutrients in the nearshore areas, major problems with algal blooms, Cladophora, those types of problems, and then in the offshore areas, not enough nutrients and major problems with the fisheries there.
Because of the drastic changes in the Great Lakes over the last 2 decades, commercial fishermen say they've had to adapt. Today, they're forced to go further and further out into the lake just to get a good catch. When the wind blows, fisherman Dennis Hickey says the algae load up their live entrapment nets, making it easier for fish to see and avoid. Hickey and his crew have to spend precious time and money to pull out the nets and clean them.
Well, it gets worse every year. It's been the last 5 years, I'd say it's been increasing.
Scrawny fish and too much algae have become game changers for many small commercial fishermen in the area.
A smaller fisherman just plain decided to sell out and get out of the farm or the business.
And the future of commercial fisheries looks bleak because scientists say removing the mussels from the lake is impossible.
Quagga mussels are going to be with us now for forever, I think. It's just a matter of at what abundance does the population stabilize, and that's the key. Scientists and activists say that while the focus must shift to preventing the introduction and spread of new invasive species into the Great Lakes, the destruction underway by the quagga mussel now serves as a painful cautionary tale.
So you can see how a tiny little invader can quickly do severe damage. And these mussels have made it all the way over to Southern California and have attacked our lakes as well. So if you have a boat, for example, a lake may force you to leave your boat out of the water for a certain length of time in order to make sure that there are no mussels attached to your boat before they even let you put your boat into the lake. We have to take, precautionary measurements now, because once these organisms make it into the lake, they are impossible to eradicate. Eutrophication is when water from poorly drained crops, for example, waterlogged crops, which would then have like all the fertilizers and the water sort of sit on top of the crops, results in runoff. And so this can also be due to livestock or other farming animals that leave their waste behind, because both feces and urine are high in these nutrients, phosphates and nitrates. And ultimately, this will result in runoff, where water runs downhill, and ultimately these enhanced nutrients will make their way to bodies of water like rivers, lakes, streams, things like that, and they will enrich these bodies of water. This is called eutrophication. This can also happen with sewage that is not treated that gets released, because sewage again is high in urine and feces, and these will also have lots of phosphates and nitrates in them. So again, this increase in nutrients that ends up in these bodies of water is called eutrophication. Eutrophication has negative effects on the ecosystem. All these excess nutrients favors the algal blooms, which means there's a lot of algae that grows on top of the water, an intense amount of algae. And ultimately, these mats of algae are going to block light from the layers below. Now, the plants that are below them do not have access to light, and then the plants will die. Eventually, these mats of algae die as well. This increased amount of death favors decomposition. When the decomposers are doing decomposition in really high amounts like this, they're doing a lot of cellular respiration, which means they're using up a lot of oxygen. When they use up all the oxygen, this increases the biological oxygen demand in that particular environment. That means a lot of oxygen is being demanded of and being used within that environment, and this leads to anoxic conditions. Anoxic means the water lacks oxygen, like anaerobic waterways, for example. The body of water is now anoxic. This means there's not enough oxygen for other organisms that live there, such as the fish, and then they will start to die as well. So here shows that picture. You can see the nitrates and phosphates leading into these bodies of water. These excess nutrients favor the growth of algae. The algae grow out of control. They form algal blooms, which block the light to the layers below, and now the plants don't have access to light and they will die. Eventually, the algae dies as well, and this increased amount in death puts a lot of organic material at the bottom of the lake that's good for decomposers. These decomposers will break them down at high rates, using up a lot of oxygen in that process for cellular respiration. This increases the BOD, or biological oxygen demand, on that ecosystem and leads to anoxic waters. This eventually kills the fish because they don't have enough oxygen for cellular respiration. Bioaccumulation is when toxins build up in tissues of living organisms. This mostly occurs in the fatty tissues because a lot of toxins tend to be fat soluble, and this makes them hard for the tissues to release them or excrete them. And so they just kind of like store up these toxins within their tissues. Well, this happens at organisms across all levels, but the problem is that when these toxins accumulate in the fatty tissues of organisms that are the food source of other organisms, then when the organisms on higher trophic level consume the organisms on lower trophic levels, they now have the toxin. And usually they have a lot more of the toxin. They tend to have more, like higher amounts of fatty tissues in upper trophic levels, so they can accumulate more within their tissues. This is known as biomagnification, where these toxins become more concentrated as we move up the food chain. So each successive trophic level accumulates more of the toxins in their tissue, and so it just becomes more concentrated. And usually 10% is the rule. So we say it on average increases in concentration by 10% as you move up each trophic level. This puts the predators at the highest risk. They will accumulate the largest concentrations of toxins throughout their lifetime. Here's an example with DDT pesticides. DDT was an insecticide that was sprayed all over crops after the World Wars to kill mosquitoes. It was very, very effective at killing mosquitoes. In fact, it was so effective that it won a Nobel Prize, and it was used worldwide. But eventually, we figured out that it was causing major complications in the reproductive systems of many organisms, and so it ultimately was banned in the United States in 1972. But it is still actually used today in other places where malaria is much higher. For example, in Africa, DDT is still very effective, and they have a lot of mosquitoes and really high malarial rates. And because of this, they still use harmful pesticides like DDT. And then we still have this persistent problem. So then these pesticides make their way into bodies of water, usually due to runoff, and then they bioaccumulate in the tissues of the smaller organisms first, for example, plankton. So once the plankton filter feed and start to accumulate this toxin, then the small fish eat the plankton and they accumulate it. Then the large fish eat the small fish and they accumulate it even further. So again, it just biomagnifies up the food chain. And so you can, going back. You can see that we said on average 10%, but it's not exactly 10%. But you do see this increase as we move up the food chain, which puts predators who are on the top of the food chain at the highest risk because they bioaccumulate the toxin at the most concentrated levels. So we saw a huge problem in reproduction of a lot of organisms. For example, birds of prey, like pelicans or hawks, they ultimately could not get their shells to harden. So they would lay soft shelled eggs, and then this would drastically decrease their hatch rate. And we almost lost several species of birds of prey to extinction because of this. It also impacted otter populations. They had a decline in their reproductive success. They even saw issues in human reproduction, where it ended up developing, higher rates of less successful births in humans, or cancers even in humans. And so again, a lot of times we start using these pesticides or insecticides or herbicides before we know the long-term effects. And the long-term effects of bioaccumulation and biomagnification can be very costly. Here's just another slide showing that food chain transfer. But remember that organisms do belong to multiple trophic levels, and just because they belong to the same trophic level does not mean they accumulate the toxin at the same amount. If they are a more fatty organism, for example, then they are going to be able to accumulate more toxins within their tissues compared to another organism on the same trophic level that's less fatty. And here shows you another example of mercury. Specifically, methyl mercury is the one that tends to have the highest rates in bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And within this, you can see that it's being released from factories and even from volcanoes and mines. So a lot of this is due to human activities that ultimately these harmful chemicals are getting leached into bodies of water. When they make it into the bodies of water, then once again, it results in bioaccumulation and biomagnification of the food chain. and mercury can have devastating effects. Mercury affected humans because humans were eating a lot of the fish that were high in mercury. That was, due to this type of issue within bodies of water. In this picture over here, you can see that this mercury thermometer has about 1 gram of mercury in it. So it's this small little amount right here, so less than a quarter's size. And that's all it takes to ruin the lake. When that little 1 drop of mercury gets into the lake, it can pollute the entire lake and lead to this terrible issues across trophic level transfer. Plastics is another issue in our oceans specifically. About 20% of plastic that is out there in the ocean was directly put there in the ocean. For example, ships that are out there that spend a long time on the ocean, they have to dump their trash somewhere. They can't just continue to accumulate it on the ship, and so they will directly dump their trash into the ocean. Or offshore platforms such as oil rigs that you see out there, they drop their trash in the ocean as well. And so all of this is done purposely. But even more than that are the plastics that get blown into water systems from litter. And so these plastics can be incredibly harmful to ocean organisms. Macroplastic is going to be large plastic that you can easily see with the naked eye. It has not yet been degraded or broken down. This can be like plastic water bottles, nets where fishermen would like troll the ocean floor and then they've left their nets out there in the ocean. Other forms of trash, buoys, buckets, lots of trash ultimately makes its way into the ocean that we can easily see with our naked eye. Microplastic is different. It results from macroplastic, as macroplastic will degrade over time due to physical and chemical processes, like from the ocean water chemistry and from the sun, for example, breaking down that plastic. And so ultimately, microplastic is really small pieces of plastic that are incredibly difficult to see, and that makes it even more difficult to remove from the ocean. The ocean has currents that will push the trash to concentrated locations, and we call these concentrated locations gyres. Essentially, they just continue to circulate the trash in these specific areas. So you can see these 5 gyres that exist in our ocean. Here, 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 here. One in particular is incredibly large. We call it the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's really 2 gyres, but ultimately they kind of swirl together and they act as one. So if you were to take a ship through the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, you'd essentially see your boat just moving through trash. Next, we're going to watch a TED Talk that talks about the harmful effects of plastic in the ocean, and it will show you these gyres.
Demands and anticipating security threats, empowering scientists with valuable data insights to help conserve coral reefs for years to come.
Let's talk trash. You know, we had to be taught to renounce the powerful conservation ethic we had developed during the Great Depression and World War II. After the war, we needed to direct our enormous production capacity toward creation of products for peacetime. Life magazine helped in this effort by announcing the introduction of throwaways that would liberate the housewife from the drudgery of doing dishes. Mental note to the liberators: throwaway plastics take a lot of space and don't biodegrade. Only we humans make waste that nature can't digest. Plastics are also hard to recycle. A teacher told me how to express the under 5% of total plastics recovered in our waste stream. It's diddly point squat. That's the percentage we recycle. Now, melting point has a lot to do with this. Plastic is not purified by the remelting process like glass and metal. It begins to melt below the boiling point of water and does not drive off oily contaminants, for which it is a sponge. Half of each year's 100 billion pounds of thermoplastic pellets will be made into fast-track trash. A large, unruly fraction of our trash will flow down rivers to the sea. Here is the accumulation at Ballona Creek next to the LA airport. And here is the flotsam near California State University Long Beach and the desal plant we visited yesterday. In spite of deposit fees, much of this trash leading out to the sea will be plastic beverage bottles. We use 2 million of them in the United States every 5 minutes, here imaged by TED presenter Chris Jordan, who artfully documents mass consumption and zooms in for more detail. Here is a remote island repository for bottles off the coast of Baja California. Isla San Roque is an uninhabited bird rookery off Baja's sparsely populated central coast. Notice that the bottles here have caps on them. Bottles made of polyethylene terephthalate, PET, will sink in seawater and not make it this far from civilization. Also, the caps are produced in separate factories from a different plastic, polypropylene. They will float in seawater, but unfortunately do not get recycled under the bottle bills. Let's trace the journey of the millions of caps that make it to sea solo. After a year, the ones from Japan are heading straight across the Pacific, while ours get caught in the California current and first head down to the latitude of Cabo San Lucas. After 10 years, a lot of the Japanese caps are in what we call the Eastern Garbage Patch, while ours litter the Philippines. After 20 years, we see emerging the debris accumulation zone of the North Pacific Gyre. It so happens that millions of albatross nesting on Kure and Midway atolls in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands National Monument forage here and scavenge whatever they can find for regurgitation to their chicks. A 4-month-old Laysan albatross chick died with this in its stomach. Hundreds of thousands of the goose-sized chicks are dying, with stomachs full of bottle caps and other rubbish, like cigarette lighters. But mostly bottle caps. Sadly, their parents mistake bottle caps for food, tossing about in the ocean surface. The retainer rings for the caps also have consequences for aquatic animals. This is Mae West, still alive at a zookeeper's home in New Orleans. I wanted to see what my hometown of Long Beach was contributing to the problem, so on Coastal Cleanup Day in 2005, I went to the Long Beach Peninsula at the east end of our Long Beach. We cleaned up the swaths of beach shown. I offered 5 cents each for bottle caps. I got plenty of takers. Here are the 1,100 bottle caps they collected. I thought I would spend $20 that day. I ended up spending nearly 60. I separated them by color and put them on display the next Earth Day at Cabrillo Marine Aquarium in San Pedro. Governor Schwarzenegger and his wife Maria stopped by to discuss the display. In spite of my girly man hat, crocheted from plastic shopping bags, they shook my hand. I showed him and Maria a zooplankton trawl from the gyre north of Hawaii with more plastic than plankton. Here's what our trawl samples from the plastic soup our ocean has become look like. Trawling a zooplankton net on the surface for a mile produces samples like this and this. Now, when the debris washes up on the beaches of Hawaii, it looks like this. And this particular beach is Kailua Beach, the beach where our president and his family vacationed before moving to Washington. Now, how do we analyze samples like this one that contain more plastic than plankton? We sort the plastic fragments into different size classes from 5 millimeters to 1/3 of a millimeter. Small bits of plastic concentrate persistent organic pollutants up to 1 million times their levels in the surrounding seawater. We wanted to see if the most common fish in the deep ocean at the base of the food chain was ingesting these poison pills. We did hundreds of necropsies, and over 1/3 had polluted plastic fragments in their stomachs. The record holder, only 2.5 inches long, had 84 pieces in its tiny stomach. Now, you can buy certified organic produce, but no fishmonger on earth can sell you a certified organic wild-caught fish. This is the legacy we are leaving to future generations. The throwaway society cannot be contained. It has gone global. We simply cannot store and maintain or recycle all our stuff. We have to throw it away. Now, the market can do a lot for us, but it can't fix the natural system in the ocean we've broken. All the king's horses and all the king's men will never gather up all the plastic and put the ocean back together again. The levels are increasing. The amount of packaging is increasing. The throwaway concept of living is proliferating, and it's showing up in the ocean.
He offers no hope of cleaning it up. Straining the ocean for plastic would be beyond the budget of any country, and it might kill untold amounts of sea life in the process. The solution, Moore says, is to stop the plastic at its source. Stop it on land before it falls into the ocean.
There's your typical t-shirt shopping bag.
And in a plastic-wrapped and packaged world, he doesn't hold out much hope for that either. This is Brian Rooney for Nightline in Long Beach, California.
Thank you.
As mentioned in the TED Talk, there are lots of negative consequences of plastics in the ocean. One is that as plastic breaks down over time, it will release chemicals that it stores up in it into the actual water. And then once these chemicals get leached out into the ocean, it can bioaccumulate in organisms on lower trophic levels and then biomagnify up the food chain. Plastic also can absorb chemicals that get stuck within the plastic. So then these bits of plastic, typically microplastic, contain highly concentrated amounts of these toxins within them, and then they act as poison pills. So when the animals ingest these pills or consume these toxic pills, these bits of plastic, it will cause harmful effects to them that way. And then, of course, they can become tangled up in the plastic. You saw the sea turtle with the ring around it. It can tangle up marine mammals under the ocean. For example, if they get trapped in the plastic nets on the ocean floor, then they can't come up for air and then they'll suffocate. They can also eat the plastic when they mistake it for food. Sea turtles may mistake bags for jellyfish. You saw the birds, marine birds, mistake plastic bottle caps and lighters and other bits of plastic as food. And then this plastic takes up space in their stomach where food cannot get into any longer. And so they often die of starvation because of this, or lack of nutrients, since they don't have any real food in their stomach. This shows you how long different things, different pollutants out in the ocean would take to break down, with the red bar being our average human life expectancy of 80 years. So you can see aluminum cans, 200 years to break down, plastic beverage holders, 400 years, diapers, plastic bottles, 450 years, and fishing lines, 600 years to break down. Really sad. Here's a bird with lots of plastic in its stomach, and then this picture shows you how plastic can both concentrate toxins within it, acting as poison pills, but also leach certain chemicals out of it, which puts those harmful chemicals into the bodies of water. Here is going to be this pretty neat video showing you how it is possible to make 6-pack rings out of something that is not bad for animals, so something other than plastic. They're actually edible by sea organisms. So I think this is really neat. So even though it is for an adult beverage, I do think it's important for you to see that there are companies out there trying to make a difference, and that it is possible to not use plastic all the time.
Every 3 minutes for an entire year. Most plastic takes years to break down and can be deadly to animals if it is ingested or if they become trapped. That's why these 4 craft brewers with a passion for beer and the ocean came up with a unique solution: the biodegradable, edible 6-pack ring.
We grew up by the beach and we're on boats and surfing and fishing all the time. Sometimes you fish and bring up a plastic bag on your hook. So our goal was to give back to the ocean, the environment, as much as possible, and using craft beer as the vessel to do it. At the end of the day, we have all the spent grain that's left over. Eco 6-pack rings are created using the spent grain from the brewing process.
The Eco 6-pack rings, which they call E6PR, start to break down within 2 hours of being in the ocean. fully disintegrate in 2 to 3 months, and completely disappear from the ocean. Even if left on the beach or somewhere else, they break down in a matter of weeks. And since they're made of the leftover wheat and grain, if it's ingested by wildlife like a fish, a turtle, or a bird, it's completely harmless to them.
There's going to be the time between when the ring ends up in the ocean, on the ground, something is able to eat it. It's not nutritious to them. It's not going to be part of their diet. However, it's a lot better eating that than plastic. I've eaten one. I'm still here. We didn't expect the feedback that we got and the interest that we did. So it's pretty apparent that it wasn't going to be able to be in-house.
So they spun off the idea into its own business called E6PR that brings together the brewery and other founding partners.
I think success in the brewery, it's definitely not about money. For us, growth, awareness, and getting more people on board. And even if they're not switching to the E6PR rings, just thinking about their packaging and changing it for the better.
A handful of breweries around the US have gotten on board, and the E6PR will soon be used in 12 different countries, including Mexico, where Corona is testing out the rings on their beers. As of last year, Saltwater Brewery eliminated plastic entirely from their packaging. They hope other distributors will follow their lead to create a more eco-friendly beer and packaging industry.
Six-pack rings, of course, are the #1 pollutant. But our view on it is if we change one thing, even if it's not the biggest problem, it gets people thinking. More and more that you see this stuff, you can think of ways to change your everyday lifestyle. Here's a good vessel, gets people to listen.
So it's pretty neat, I think, to see that there are ways to make change out there. We just have to figure it out and take action. These small companies are doing it, and it's really expensive for them. The more companies they can get on board, the cheaper it becomes to process things like this. Plastic is really cheap to make, and a lot of companies use it because of that. But if there was an alternative that was also cheap to make that was less harmful, why wouldn't we do that? So again, just thinking about changes for a more sustainable future, I think is really something to be thinking about. Okay, next topic, deforestation. Deforestation is the purposeful clearing of forest land, and humans do this for a variety of reasons, with the #1 reason typically being logging. That means we want to use the trees, the logs from the trees, to build things, so as building materials, build houses, build businesses, build a lot of things. We also clear the land for agriculture, so farming of crops, farming of animals, things like that. We also clear the land to build, right? To put houses, to put businesses, things like that. But deforestation comes with a whole lot of problems. It can cause climate change because, we're clearing the trees, and when we clear the trees, that's less photosynthesis that's being done, so less CO2 being removed from the atmosphere means more CO2 staying in the atmosphere, leads to global warming. Soil erosion can occur. Weak or fewer crops can occur. Flooding. A whole lot of problems for native people that live there. And honestly, potentially, the entire ecosystem can collapse, which a lot of organisms depend on that ecosystem. So that alone is incredibly damaging. A loss of a lot of biodiversity may occur. The example that IB wants you to know is in the rainforest. So tropical rainforests are being deforested a lot, and they may be at a tipping point. So remember, a tipping point is when an ecosystem has reached this point where it could no longer be resilient. It's not going to be able to come back to its original ecosystem. Instead, that ecosystem will be converted into a different type of ecosystem. So this will result in the loss of the rainforest if this does in fact happen. So when we deforest the rainforest, we take away the trees, so now they have less trees. Less trees means less transpiration or water being released from the trees. If there's less water in the atmosphere, there's less clouds. Less clouds leads to less precipitation, which leads to drought. When we don't have enough water in the soil, then that particular forest is going to be prone to fires since it's so dry. This leads to positive feedback, of course, because those fires puts a lot of emissions, carbon emissions, into the atmosphere. In addition to that, the removal of the trees, of course, means less photosynthesis, so less CO2 being removed from the atmosphere, just further enhancing this pattern of not having enough or having too many emissions in the atmosphere, leading to increased temperatures. What this could do, if we do go past that tipping point, is we could have an abrupt change where the cleared parts of the rainforest now get converted into grasslands. And so that would be a huge problem because the tropical rainforests are home to a lot of biodiverse organisms. They actually have the most biodiversity of anywhere else on the planet. So this would be a huge loss. Anthropogenic species extinction. So scientists are saying that the sixth and current mass extinction is being caused by humans. So they're saying eventually we are going to cause the extinction of a lot of organisms because of our behaviors. And so there are a lot of reasons for this, most of which we've already talked about. Overharvesting. We're removing a lot of resources from environments that we're not returning. For example, when we harvest crops, those crops get removed and they get driven to other locations where they get consumed by humans. That means that the nutrients that have just been removed from those crops never get returned to the soil. Remember, natural ecosystems allow organisms to die and then get decomposed, and then that returns the nutrients back to the soil. But that's not true of crops. Crops get removed, so they don't go through that natural decomposition. And then humans consume those crops, and when they die, their bodies don't get decomposed by decomposers, and so we're not returning those nutrients back to the soil in that way either. So these soils get continuously depleted of their nutrients. That's why farmers have to constantly add fertilizers to their crops. But again, adding fertilizers means more mining, right? We have to get those fertilizers from somewhere. We have to mine for that phosphorus, for example. And so it's just kind of this perpetuating cycle. Habitat destruction. We are destroying a lot of habitats out there through deforestation and other methods of clearing habitats. And this is causing a lot of organisms that live there to be displaced and could lead to their extinction. They have nowhere to go. We're seeing this even here in Southern California. We have a lot of large cats, like the mountain lions, that have nowhere to go. So we're seeing them more and more come into town. Same with coyotes, right? We've taken so much of their land that they're now coming into human territory because that used to be their territory. So where are they supposed to go? Invasive species, like we said, get brought over by humans on ships a lot of times, and these can be devastating to ecosystems. Pollution, only humans cause pollution. Pollution can be from runoff from crops. Pollution can be from other sprays that we do. Pollution can be from factories, from cars. Lots of things lead to pollution, which leads to problems. And then, of course, global climate change. So all of these things are enhancing global climate change, and that is leading to a whole host of problems globally. There's going to be some specific case studies that you need to pay attention to when you do the Part 7 study questions. Here's a graph that shows the 5 mass extinctions that have occurred throughout history. Remember, all of these mass extinctions were due to things that were out of our control. Things like asteroid collisions that led to climate change, volcanic eruptions that led to climate change, stuff like that. But the 6th mass extinction, which is showing possibly down here, present time, that may happen in the future, is in our control. This is caused by humans. There have been anthropogenic losses of ecosystems and will continue to have more likely in the future, which just further perpetuates the 6th mass extinction. So these ecosystem losses can be categorized as direct or indirect. Direct means that we purposely cleared the land for our use, and so we knew it would result in ecosystem loss. For example, agriculture expansion, when we need more crops, more farming, we clear that land for that specific purpose. Urbanization means homes, buildings, businesses, things like that. We clear the land purposely for that. Mining is when we pull nutrients from the earth as we mine for it. Things like coal gets mined for to burn as a fossil fuel, oil gets drilled for, phosphorus gets mined for from sedimentary rock. And so all of that is destructive as well. Smelting is similar. It's just that this time we're looking for metals in the earth. but again, it's very damaging. We build dams, and then we can extract the water from those dams. And remember that dams can also lead to flooding of that ecosystem, and this water would be extracted for human usages. We also can divert water and put drainage systems in so we can use that water for human consumption or other uses as well, like agriculture land, things like that. When we drain swamplands or marshes, for example, for crops. So again, these are all things that we've done purposely, knowing it would harm the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem. Indirect would mean the ecosystem collapses due to unintentional causes. Like we still caused it, but that wasn't the intent. For example, over exploitation of resources. This would be removing too many resources from the environment, whether it's like hunting or fishing, something like that, where we needed those resources as, a food source, but we didn't do it responsibly. And so overall, it led to us removing too much from that ecosystem and caused a decline in those organisms. Leaching of fertilizers into bodies of water. So for example, factories and agriculture will leach chemicals, and when it gets to those bodies of water, it can have harmful effects on those ecosystems. And then climate change, of course, so all these emissions that have increased in the atmosphere since industrialization, those would be indirect as well. And again, there's going to be more case studies in your study questions on ecosystem losses due to human interferences, so please pay attention to those when you do the Part 7 study questions. And there's evidence towards a biodiversity crisis. A journalist would use the term biodiversity crisis to basically describe these massive losses of ecosystems and the species within them that are occurring today. But before making a claim like this, a scientist would look for reliable evidence from reliable sources. And we do, in fact, have reliable evidence from reliable sources to support biodiversity crises. And so one of these governmental agencies is called Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. And what this company does is they globally study biodiversity in different locations around the world and perform surveys on them. So these surveys are going to include information about species evenness and species richness, so we can study how diverse these are. These particular studies have to be repeated. So that means we would have to do them, year after year, or every few years, or every 10 years, whatever they decide makes the most sense for each specific ecosystem, so that we can constantly compare and see, have there been changes, right? Have we lost biodiversity? And so this helps us to figure out which ecosystems are in a crisis versus which ones are maybe not yet. IB also wants you to understand that contributions to these particular studies can be made by both expert scientists as well as citizen scientists. So a lot of times we get people, activists, who want to make a change, who want to see a difference, who want to help study what's happening out there in our ecosystems, who help perform these surveys and report their information to these agencies. And that is also helpful information. The causes of this biodiversity crisis are due to humans. They say that in 1970 is when the crisis began, but by 2019, about 75% of our land environments, so terrestrial environments, and 66% of marine environments have been altered severely due to human causes. And so we've talked about most of these already, right? Hunting and other forms of overexploitation, urbanization, building houses, deforestation, clearing land for other things like agriculture, which results in habitat loss for organisms, introduction of invasive species, which can spread these pests within an ecosystem, resulting in loss, and it can also help spread diseases. All of these things have one thing in common. They are all due to human involvement. And we attribute this to the rapid human population growth that is currently going on. Since 1920, human population has more than quadrupled. And this is further exacerbating all of these problems. And that is it for the Part 7 notes.